this study actually is really our way of moving beyond the sort of rhetoric into trying to look at what does it mean for institutions to really take this on. And so I hope we'll have a really rich conversation and discussion around that. We're also currently sort of providing the secretarial function for the G20 and the Sustainable Finance Working Group, and a lot of the conversations that we're having really will touch upon the conversation this morning. So I really look forward to a rich conversation, something that will really try to move this agenda across South Africa. My role in the Africa Sustainable Finance Hub actually is to see how we can kind of roll this out across the rest of Africa. And of course, South Africa is very much leading in terms of this kind of work already. So I'll try and keep it short, as I said, but I think just to kind of maybe close off by saying that when we all went through the COVID pandemic, what began as a health crisis that was meant to be handled by our governments, by public finance, very, very quickly became a socioeconomic crisis that hit everybody's bottom line. And I think that was really emblematic in many ways of why sustainability, the SDGs, as we call them in the UN, is critical for everybody to take their part, to play their part in trying to address and incorporate nature within their business models, within the strategic business approaches that we have, because we can't continue to function the way that we've always functioned. We can't continue to move forward with business as usual. It's really important to start to think about these broader aspects around where we sit within our businesses, within the context of the ecosystem of the globe. So it's really, really critical. And I think that was a real lesson that we learned, and certainly for UNDP, we've been pushing forward with the idea that we need to go beyond ESG as the tick box exercise to really thinking about what does nature, what are the implications of our agency on the planet towards nature and also towards climate change. So with those notes, let me just hand it back to Thomas and let us get straight into the business of the day. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane, and thanks very much for that introduction. We'll get into a little bit more detail of the UNDP a bit later and their participation, I think, globally with respect to some of these nature and finance disclosure frameworks and involvement, and I think they're one of the key and strategic players in this emerging landscape at the moment. I'd like to call on Yassine Lockhart to come up. Yassine's going to do going to give a bit of a private sector representation with regards to what's happening at the domestic finance institution level, as specifically representing the Banking Association of South Africa. Thanks, Yassine.
Thank you. I must admit that I have a much more longer speech prepared. So with that, I'm honored to be here today on behalf of the Banking Association to provide some insights on the banking sector. So BASA is a representative body for over 30 commercial banks in South Africa. We have a long history of working to promote sustainable finance, and we are committed to working with our members to understand the opportunities and the risks associated with climate change and biodiversity. BASA's mandate is to advance the interest of the industry with its regulators, legislators, and stakeholders to make banking sustainable, profitable, and better able to contribute to the social and economic development and transformation of the country. From this, I think it's very apparent how crucial the topic is for the association. Our history of sustainability. BASA's commitment to sustainability dates back to 2008, when we established the Sustainable Finance Committee. The purpose of the committee is to provide a forum for our members to share best practice, learn from each other, and advocate for sustainable banking in non-competitive areas. In 2011, we published a code of conduct for managing environmental and social risks, which was updated in 2015 and became the principles for managing environmental and social risk. The document sets out the principles that our members should follow in their operations and in their lending and investment practices. So over the last 5 years, there's been a significant focus on climate. In 2018, we designated climate risk as a priority area. We established a dedicated climate risk committee, and we have been working closely with the South African government, the financial regulators, and other stakeholders to address the risks posed by climate change via the Climate Risk Forum. The Climate Risk Forum gave effect to the recommendations of Financing a Sustainable Economy, which is a technical paper released by National Treasury. Most notable output was the Green Finance Taxonomy. So looking a bit more on our work on nature-related risks, in recent times, we have also become increasingly aware of the risk posed to nature. We are working with our members to develop a better understanding of these risks, and there's an appreciation that sustainability needs to be addressed more holistically across both the social and environmental dimensions. I'm excited and pleased to announce that just last week, we signed a cooperation agreement with the IFC on climate support, which is a significant step. However, on nature, we're looking at some exciting initiatives for the sector, and we hope to announce this in coming weeks. I think this highlights our commitment to collaboration. BASA believes that collaboration is essential to addressing the challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. We've been working closely with a range of partners, including the United Nations Environmental Programme Finance Initiative, the Sustainable Banking and Finance Network, and the International Banking Federation's Environmental Concerns Task Group. Through these partnerships, BASA has been able to provide its members with extensive support in the area for both capacity building and advocacy. We have hosted a number of workshops and training sessions on climate risk and nature-related risks, including the Encore project with Natural Capital Finance Alliance. So looking at our future priorities, I think we'd like to continue to work with our members to help them understand and manage the risk posed by climate change and biodiversity loss. We look to provide resources to help our members and measure and report on their sustainability performance. And lastly, advocate for policies that support the transition to a sustainable economy. So BASA is committed to playing a role in the global efforts to address climate change and biodiversity loss. We believe that the banking industry has a critical role to play in this effort, and we are committed to working with our members, the regulators, and other stakeholders to make a difference. In closing, I would like to thank the UNDP BioFund program for inviting me to speak today, and I hope that this can further the role of collaboration in this area. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Yassine, for those insights and perspectives. There's just been a little bit of a change to the program at the moment. We were going to have a presentation from our UNDP global colleagues with regards to the TNFD and what the next steps were, but unfortunately they're not able to attend. They've had, Ms. Malik has had a family crisis, so unfortunately will not be able to give that presentation. So we're going to go directly into the presentation of the findings, and I will start with that soon. As soon as we can sort out some of these tech issues. All right. Sorry about that. Please. There we go. Right. Thanks very much for that. So I'm going to run through these, the report, just give a little bit of context, seeing that we've got a little bit of time. I can embellish, and I've got the floor for a longer period of time, which is also it's always appreciated, because I think there's a lot to say in this nature-related finance disclosure space. So just a little bit of the outline. We're going to have a little bit of a discussion just up front in terms of keeping it in context. What has happened globally over the last 3 to 5 years, I would say, in the nature-related space, specifically in disclosure and awareness, and then maybe taking a slightly down the rabbit hole, and we'll have a look at what's happened in the climate change space over the last 10 years, but just briefly a discussion around that. And then looking at the review itself, what the objectives of the study and the review was, some introductory positioning statements around that, looking at the institutional review itself, and there I'm really going to just highlight some of the key aspects. The report is lengthy, and it is going to be made available by the UNDP. There will be a link to the summary report as well as the final report, and then you can really go and look at the context and the detail in a lot more time, because unfortunately we don't have that amount of time here to go through that. So we'll look at the conclusions and then the recommendations. So just a couple of graphics just to position where this emerging nature-related financial disclosure trend is starting to emerge. I think what we've seen specifically over the last 10 years is and sometimes I would venture to say, an overtly focused attention on climate change, but for obvious and due reasons, it has been mainstreamed over the last, particularly 10 years. And I mean, these are the kind of news reports and events that we see taking place consistently, yearly, I would say, for the last 5 to 10 years. California wildfires, who would have ever thought that you'd see Venice underwater as soon as this? And then obviously the impacts of droughts and widespread changes in climatic events globally taking place. And these types of events obviously materialize and translate into economic shocks and surprise, and resources shocks and surprise. And I think we're seeing the vulnerability of the global financial system starting to play with a lot of these aspects coming out. And obviously, it's not as simple as saying that there's one significant driver of change, such as biodiversity loss or climate change. But surely, this does exacerbate the problem going forward. And it's one of these emerging risk areas that needs to be taken into consideration when you're looking at your credit portfolios and extending credit and financing. So we're seeing a lot of these happening. I mean, at the bottom, you see these two ladies with masks on. Those are not COVID masks. These are photos pre-COVID, and that is due to the wildfires taking place in Australia. And the top right photograph is not cloud cover as it seems, but a myriad of fires taking place in the Amazon basin. So, these are these big structural types of risks and shocks which manifest locally within the financial systems. And obviously, as you see, financial collapse and these systemic risks. And I think one thing which is interesting about this slide and taking it into the findings of the review is the important part that the regulator has to play. And I do know that we have the South African Reserve Bank in the audience today. So, how this manifests and who's going to be responsible for this and what type of capacity, etc., are issues that we're going to be touching on as we go forward. And then obviously the widespread destruction of nature. And, it's sort of been the latent, silent elephant, to use a proverbial elephant in the room. It's been nature, The destruction of nature is one side of the coin and the other side of the same coin is climate change. And these two are interacting entities in themselves. And that type of relationship, I think, is important and starting to emerge post this little experience that we had, the emergence of pandemics. And, I often sit back and think about this and ponder about, what are the apart from the socioeconomic impacts that the pandemic has, what has it had in terms of the way that we think about the world and think about the world going forward? And for me personally, it's about this interregnum that we had for a 2-year period. It caused us to stop and sit. And I mean, there's been multiple, I would say, articles and expressions, etc., that have come out from this time where everybody said the world was at pause for 2 years. And certainly it was. But what it did illustrate at the end of those 2 years are the vulnerabilities and the sensitivities of the system. And that has been exposed. And I think post-COVID, we've seen this, I would venture to say, scramble around the nature-based risks globally taking place. So just coming back to, so with a bit of context around that and that type of positioning, I think some of just notion, and coming back to the review document itself, some of the key objectives is that we've seen this emergence of nature-based risk over the last 3 to 5 years. And I think what this report does, it gives a general institutional readiness perspective for the South African financial system and how this system has the ability or inability to respond to this emerging global trend. And some of these key objectives include, to assess what the institutional policy and regulatory gaps and opportunities for the readiness for financial related disclosures are, nature related. I'm going to be saying nature related a lot this morning, I can see that. Assessment of the institutional arrangements and readiness, and looking at the capacity and competency of national as well as local economic agents. And I think we have both of them in the room this morning, in fact, a bit more. And we'll touch on that in the panel later this morning, where we've got representation from multilateral agencies that are working in the space, from DFIs, commercial banks, as well as and associations, etc., and government representation. And then obviously to provide recommendations on, how do you look at this nature-related reporting integration into the South African financial sector. So just by way of a little bit of an introduction, and I said I've added a couple of slides in here, so I'm at liberty to embellish a little bit. I think it's about the way that we think about ecosystems and ecosystem services. And I've had some discussions with FIs and with the Banking Association around this whole issue around nature or natural capital related impacts and dependencies, risks and opportunities. But these founding concepts, I think, are pretty critical in understanding how we would approach this disclosure ecosystem and environment that's taking place. So I'm going to take you back to 2005 with the IPBES report, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. It is one of those seminal pieces of work that actually gave rise to the concepts that we look at when we look at nature-related disclosures and the context in which we encapsulate it from a technical perspective. And it's the way we think about ecosystems and what do ecosystems do. And this whole issue around the supporting, provisioning, regulatory, and also the cultural services that the environment provides humanity, society, businesses, and economies for basically free. And I think some of the, we'll see some trends taking place in terms of ecosystem accounting. We'll allude to some of that work as well that's been done by government as part of this review. And then, the underpinning natural capital assets that support these ecosystems going forward. And for those of you interested, if you delve further into the encore work of the previous NCFA, National Capital Finance Alliance, now known as the Encore Partnership, they make that correlation between, impacts and dependencies and the financial system as it is as a whole. So following IPBES and work still done by IPBES was the Global Assessment 2019. And this is work that's been built on the framework of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. But I think what's very interesting in this piece of work, and also very seminal, because this piece of work gave impetus to the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework, the Global Biodiversity Framework 2020, the Kunming Montreal COP that was held in Montreal at the end of last year, which for nature is basically the same as a climate change COP except for nature. This was an underpinning framework that gave rise to the development of the targets of the GBF. And I think what's important here is this understanding once again about impact drivers and direct drivers on the ecosystems that support the economies and how these economies rely on those specific impact ecosystem services. And I think what's come out of this report, and it's, there's been, I think, a tremendous amount of awareness in terms of the severity of the decline of the natural system following this. So just to go through a couple of these points, 47% of the natural ecosystems have declined over this period of time. We're looking at species extinction risk, and the statistics that's been popularized in the media, but 25% of species are already threatened with extinction. And these are some of these species we haven't even yet discovered. Ecological communities declined by 23%, and biomass and species abundance have fallen by 82%. And these are significant numbers if you think that these are the underpinning assets which support us as society and the economies on which we depend. So, these are really things that we need to take consideration of in terms of the way that we conduct our businesses going forward. So let's put this all into monetary terms. We've heard a little bit about I would say the academia behind understanding these concepts, but what does this mean for our economies? So the Nature Risk Rising report published by the World Economic Forum in 2020, I think was also one of those precursor reports, because leading from this specific report, we've seen a myriad of other reports over the last specifically 2 years. And I would say the work that was done by the WEF in terms of nature risk rising actually was a catalyst for further assessment, specifically by central banks, and I will allude to that. I don't have them in the slides, unfortunately. I didn't know I was going to have a bit more time. I could have put them in, regarding this understanding of how specific jurisdictions in the world, how their economies are underpinned by nature-related risks, impacts, and opportunities. So this specific report, and this is a figure that's been bandied around, I think, in every single natural capital or nature-related presentation that I've ever attended, contributes $44 trillion to the global GDP, and which underpins this critical importance, that nature, natural capital, and the systems are required for the stability of the global system. This report further alludes to Africa, that 23% of our GDP is highly dependent on nature, and 39% is moderately dependent directly on nature. So if you take those aspects into consideration and thinking about the African context and looking and having an understanding that primary production processes such as mining and agriculture are highly dependent on nature and the ecosystem services that underpin it. South Africa, I think, is one of those jurisdictions where we're starting to advance into secondary and tertiary value-added services, etc. Some of the statistics, starting to compete globally, not in a primary production process anymore. But if you look at some of the data, we are still highly dependent as a country, and with our GDP in the primary production sector. So still a very important aspect that we cannot neglect. So looking at some of the WEF work and taking this a little bit further, I always enjoy popping the slide up because it really tells a tremendous story around the hyperconnectedness of these interrelated risks and what do those specific feedback loops look like. And just taking this simple diagram on your right, and actually this, I think it's very difficult to represent it two-dimensionally. In fact, this is a three-dimensional perspective and maybe even a four-dimension. We have something like climate action, and an inability to climate action or failure in that regard gives rise to extreme weather events, natural disasters, etc. And what is really interesting about this is the interconnectedness between nature-related risks, financial risks, social instability, etc., etc., etc. And it's almost like a spider's web. If you had to pluck on one of these cords and it just sends shocks and shivers throughout the economic system. And if you're looking at translating this back to financial risks, you'll understand that environmental or nature-related risks, manifest as physical, transitional system, and reputational risks, in that regard. And we have some, I think, local current examples around these specific types of risks taking place. And moving on from that. I think what's important is to take note of this transition risk. So this report is going to really, this review really focused quite significantly, I would say, around the transition risk and the impending transition risks and how we're going to deal with them, because those are the kind of risks that also manifest in the physical realm, and how do you address your physical risk problems through policy interventions, and etc. Taking another leading from the World Economic Forum, and as you'll notice that underneath the top 10 business risks, nature-related risks are in the top 3, and it's been there for the last couple of years. And it's been interesting. We've been watching this transition of nature-related risks and climate-related risks over the last 10 years, specifically from the WF. And it's been interesting to see how these types of risks have been climbing the ladder, and being a environmental person at heart. 10 years ago, I questioned, why isn't environmental risk, underneath the top 5? But obviously there were other global priorities that were taking place at the time. But it's interesting to see that these are now the most prominent of the risks. So a report that was published by PwC and WWF, also some of the very early work in 2022, made this statement that biodiversity is emerging as the next frontier in financial risk management, and indeed it is so. So just coming back to the report itself, so a little bit of an interlude in the introduction from the report, and I'm just going to touch on these. I'm not going to go into a lot more detail. You can read the report yourselves, but I think just a couple of aspects that really stood out, I think, in looking at this review, and I think which is pertinent for the consideration, and I must emphasize it, of where nature-related financial risk disclosure is going to develop, I would say, within the South African context. And looking at roles and mandates of financial authorities, I think what's really important has come out is the responsibility and the mandate of the South African Reserve Bank, the SARB, as well as the Prudential Authority. And I'd like to lump those two together and just think of them as the regulator, if it were. And if you think about what the mandate of the SARB is to protect and enhance the financial stability of the South African financial system by monitoring the strengths and weaknesses of the financial system. So really a very important part that they play. And we've seen, which is interesting, we've seen the SARB take a lot more of a proactive approach over the last 5 years, specifically around the climate change narrative, in terms of looking at ways to intervene in the South African financial system to ensure that there's stability within that system. And they have recognized that the increasing severity of climate change is impacting that stability, and particularly, I think, in the finance sector and even more so in the insurance sector. So we're speaking to banks this morning, and I think it's really important that there's a transition, I think, in thinking about the way that you look at these in terms of risk. I know that majority of the banks are looking at the credit exposure, looking at this type of risk, and I'm just going to allude to a interesting discussion that we had recently, and maybe allude to a little bit of a analogy of what this kind of risk looks like. You're quite heavily exposed in the how would I say, the agri sector. You've got a large loan book in that sector. Most of the farmers, of the smaller farmers, are marginal and cannot afford to have a poor season or two. So they potentially can absorb an initial drought, but 2 years of drought to 3 years of drought to 4 years of drought in a row, and you're out of business. And the bank attaches the assets, which are the farms, in lieu of the credit. And then what the bank is sitting with is a multitude of farms that they can't swing. You can't sell it. And these are these other types of stranded assets that we're busy looking at. So there's a lot of talk about stranded assets in the finance system, etc. But these are certain of these stranded assets that are new narratives which we're not thinking of as stranded assets, because nobody's going to buy that farm, specifically in certain geographies of this country, due to this impending and emerging climate-related and biodiversity-related risks. And thinking about climate change and biodiversity as two sides of the same coin, we cannot separate them. So ultimately, it becomes a climate-nature-related risk, manifesting as a stranded asset. And further, I think the SARB acknowledges the importance and the role in adapting to and mitigating climate change by improving information flows, and I think that's quite important. We've had a discussion with the SARB recently, and it goes around data, and we'll talk a bit about in the conclusions around data and data availability and reliability of data. And then obviously the Prudential Authority, working very closely with the SARB's economic analysis team, and they've established the Prudential Authority Climate Change Risk Tank, the PACT, to promote, develop and coordinate regulatory and supervisory response to climate change risk. And I think it's just a question of time when the regulator is going to start thinking about how do these nature-related risks, how do we respond to these nature-related risks through supervisory guidance. So one of the initiatives, I would say, from government has been this emergence of the natural capital ecosystem accounting in South Africa, and it's known as the National Natural Capital Accounts, and NNCA. And as you will know, that we're in an alphabet soup within this larger ESG/sustainability discourse. I always venture to say, look, it is beyond a soup. This is a cross between a Mediterranean and a Mexican paella, because it is full of stuff. Being involved in the environmental sphere for the last 30 years, we've seen this, this alphabet and this taxonomy develop over the years, that if you don't have your tabs on it, you're going to get lost. So this was a joint venture between DFFE, Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, and the South African National Biodiversity Institute and Stats SA. It's been a collaboration between the two entities for the last couple of years, and I think some really interesting work. So I'm not going to go into significant detail around it. You can go and read about it in the report. But what they've been able to do, and it's interesting, using spatial data and non-spatial alphanumeric type of data, they've looked at South Africa, degraded areas, developed areas, and what does the counts look like for the country in terms of the remaining biodiversity or natural areas that are over. So very important information, I would say, in terms of decision making. And I don't think the report does allude to the fact that this data isn't being used extensively, I think, by domestic institutions and possibly also within government itself. And I think there's a great opportunity to take that information and use it in applied fashion in terms of identifying where your risk areas are. Some of the other regulatory instruments that have come out of DFFE have been the set or the classification listing of endangered or critical ecosystems, and they've got the CBA's critical biodiversity areas and critical biodiversity support area, spatial data, which has also informed the NNCA work. And those are sort of some of the, I would say, base layers that starts informing this larger picture around this emerging narrative around nature risk. And just alluding to that and going back to some of the earlier statements I made around the WEF work that was seminal in starting, I would say, a snowball of alternative economic analysis of nature-based risk. Just following on that, and I'll just allude to them, the Dutch Central Bank was the first banking institution to bring out a report which actually valued the exposure of the Dutch economy, not the GDP, but the Dutch economy at a domestic exposure level to nature-related risks, looking at the impacts and dependencies specifically, and what is that economic ecosystem's exposure to nature-related risk, and they quantified that in euros. I was going to say guild, but they've moved on in euros. And following on that, we've seen the same work being done by Banque de France. The same is being currently conducted by the Bank of England through their Sustain project. And we've seen the Bank of Mexico come up with some very interesting metrics in looking at the impacts and dependencies of nature-related risks within their economic ecosystem. And I can rattle off a whole, but what's interesting, the latest is the Bank of Philippines with a report coming out in June of this year, also looking at nature-related risks and the impacts and dependencies. And each of these banks have had a different lens and a different application of, different frameworks in terms of establishing these financial risk exposures. And just alluding back to this NCA work, I think that this could potentially be also used to do this kind of work, and a precursor to looking at South Africa's domestic level nature-related risk exposure. Just looking at further institutions that collate data. So the report goes into a lot of detail about institutions which collate data, not necessarily finance-related data, but data that could potentially support a movement towards nature-related financial disclosures. So DFFE, again, forestry, fish and environment, obviously playing a large part in the greenhouse gas emissions reporting underneath the GHG reporting regulations, and which supports the carbon tax. So some of these types of initiatives, I would say, support and give rise to an ideology or concept about how we would look at nature-related financial disclosures. I don't see DFFE as the body looking at the finance sector side of it specifically, but definitely in terms of nature-related and the nature component of it, they would be the custodians of that type of information. And then obviously looking at the NCA and the SANB work and the ecosystem EI4WS, ecological infrastructure for water security work that was done by through SANB and the DBSA. We're going to be speaking to Julie Clark from the DBSA a bit later as one of the DFIs who've been driving and being instrumental in that EI4WS project. Just looking at some of the other institutional arrangements that would have some kind of influence, and not necessarily directly, but some kind of influence in the space, looking at the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, and some of their sub-institutions within them, like the Financial Reporting Standards Council and the CIPC, the Companies and Intellectual Properties Commission. A couple of weeks ago, which was quite interesting for me, in fact, a bit of an eye-opener. A couple of weeks ago, we had the head of the CIPC in this exact room at the launch of the ISSB standards underneath the IFRS, S1 and S2, and we'll get to that a bit later, speaking about how that institution will be considering this emerging sustainability standard going forward and what's important for that in terms of corporate disclosures. And I think that department within itself has had a significant role to play with regards to corporate governance, especially the G in the ESG space. And then obviously the Financial Reporting Standards Council, looking at what type of standards are applicable for implementation at a corporate level in South Africa. And once again, there's this, and we'll touch on a schematic shortly in terms of this emerging narrative around this convergence of global sustainability reporting standards underneath the ISSB. And I alluded to the fact that we had the launch a couple of weeks ago of the sustainability standard, IFRS S1 and IFRS 2, the carbon disclosure standard. And I'll allude to a little bit more later around that. And then some of the other institutional arrangements that collect data from a statutory perspective, the minerals, resources and energy, they obviously keep a register of EMPRs for each of the mines and a register of mining post-closure provisions, which are financial provisions. How that plays into the bigger architecture of what we're discussing this morning is uncertain, but it is an institution which has financially related information. Stats SA, we've mentioned before, and I think Stats SA are relatively agnostic in terms of the application of the data that they collect, and they actually make it quite explicit in their presentations that they're not data analysts, but they collect data and they make sure that that data is accurate and complete, etc., for use for other purposes within the institutional arrangements of government and further afield into the private sector. And I think I haven't really seen too much movement around DPME, but DPME mandated to monitor the country's progress against the SDGs. And I think it's quite important to understand that the architecture of this global disclosure framework space is fundamentally underpinned by the targets of the SDGs. So there's not a lot of narrative around the SDGs, but the SDGs do provide that global base against which all the other frameworks, etc., get developed. And they're looking, and DPME themselves, coordinate and look at the coherence and alignment of strategic plans within the country. And what's interesting about, I think, the Commission is that they're represented by sector specialists. So you've got that deep insight into governmental institutional arrangements with a bit of a academic and private sector influence in that regard. So there are a couple of questions that get asked, with regards to nature-related financial disclosures, in terms of the mandates, etc. Who should be mandated to collect this financial information? And the report goes into a lot of detail around that, specifically from an institutional perspective. And I'll share a couple of thoughts towards the end with regards to mandatory and voluntary disclosure. I think that there's uncertainty in this regard, specifically around nature-related disclosures. It's been easy and there's been a lot of traction and on climate change due to its, I would say, its prominence. But when we start talking about nature-related disclosures, there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of grey areas around that. And the capacity and competency and the suitability to act as a repository for nature-related financial disclosures largely depends on the mandates of the organizations collating the data. And I think we did allude to a couple of institutional arrangements earlier that would be ideally suited to start promoting and start collating this data with its capacities intact. And then why should a statutory institution be interested in nature-related disclosures? This is another question, and I think it's quite evident. Maybe I'm preaching to the congregation at this point, but I think it's if we're not aware that nature is the next frontier in financial risk management, then we might be missing the boat. And I think with climate change and how these aspects are busy translating into financial risks, it should be a relatively high priority if you're in a domestic finance institution or if you're a government institution and you need to start considering how you're going to hedge and mitigate and adapt to these emerging global finance system risks, shocks, and surprise. I'm just going to touch on a couple of very interesting aspects, which the report also alludes to, the voluntary disclosure uptake around the banks and the various frameworks that get implemented. So King Code, obviously, as a corporate, if you're not looking at good corporate governance, then we have a couple of illustrations of what's happened to companies where there's been governance, not enough governance oversight, and what has happened globally. So adoption in sample, 93%. I'm just going to allude to a couple of them. And then the integrated reporting framework, which South Africa was quite instrumental in promoting underneath. And we'll have a look how that architecture fits in a bit later with regards to the diagram. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, 71%, CDP. So a lot of the commercial banks have been reporting on CDP for the last 10 years, I would say. I've had this discussion with one of them just recently, and what we're seeing is this convergence from the CDP into the TCFD, which makes a logical transition underneath the IFRS. And then the JSE, FTSE, and then obviously with the JSE sustainability guidance that's just recently coming Shamilia, it was last year. That's correct. A lot more requirements around listed companies, in terms of meeting those standards, and then some of these others. But you'll see aspects such as the natural capital accounting and the task force for nature-related disclosures with 0% uptake at the moment. 2 South African banks piloting the TNFD process at the moment, so that would probably not be 0% anymore, but it's also to format, I think 18 September when it gets launched this year, we'll see quite significant uptake, I would believe, with that, and a lot of complexity coming with that as well. On the insurers, probably larger uptake due to the risk exposure. King 4 Code 100%, and as you can see, if you had to compare the metrics between banks and insurers, you will see that there is a lot more uptake from insurers with regards to certain of the disclosure frameworks, and that is on the basis of the amount of risk that they underwrite and carry. And it's interesting, we talk about stranded assets, etc., but within this specific sector of the, or the specific grouping within the finance institution sector, we're noticing that globally with reassurers, there are some geographies where you just cannot get insurance, and this is quite interesting. And we saw the California wildfires right up front, and that's a point to make, is that if you are a homeowner in certain areas of California, you just can't get insurance for your home, and that leaves you exposed. And I think we're starting to see this emerge potentially locally, where if you're living in a certain geography or jurisdiction with a certain type of risk, you get underwritten, and it comes around to this cost of capital, which ultimately gets translated down or distilled down to the individual. And these can, and this is how this kind of risk translates into a system and then distills through a system, and when it starts hurting us individually from a financial perspective. The report also speaks to the global voluntary disclosure architecture, and I think this is quite important to understand. If we're talking about nature-related financial disclosures, where's this convergence taking place? Where does the TNFD, where does nature-related financial disclosures fit within the global, I would say, disclosure architecture? And this is important in terms of how we position ourselves as a country from the private sector and a statutory sector as well. And I'm just going to give a little bit of a rundown of what's actually happening here. So the IFRS institution was aggregated the CDP, the CDSP on the climate-related side on the right, and then you've got the integrated reporting frameworks on that would be on your left-hand side, sorry, your right-hand side, which is converging into the IFRS. So these are really important, I would say, moves in converging the different global disclosure frameworks. And the ISSB comes out of the IFRS, and they've just, as I alluded to, launched the two standards. Although still is a standalone reporting framework, there's really complementarity between what's happening in the ISSB and the GRI, and the two are aligned. And we see that taking place with the TNFD process as well. So there's convergence between all these frameworks, and the TNFD framework, and I'm not going to go into that in detail whatsoever. However, the four thematic areas disclosure thematic areas, it shares with the TCFD framework. So there was an intentionality behind ensuring that those two frameworks would have complementarity, and that I would believe over time that we would see some or other form of convergence taking place due to the fact that those four thematic disclosure areas are shared between the two frameworks. TNFD obviously a lot more complicated than the TCFD framework due to the fact that you're trying to address multiple indicators, metrics, targets, where the TCFD, you're talking about carbon dioxide equivalent in terms of your measurement protocols. And to support the TNFD process in understanding this complexity of metrics, targets, and indices is the LEAP process. L for locate, E for evaluate, A for S, and P for prepare. And that is the differentiator between the TCFD and the TNFD process. So obviously going into a lot more detail in the TNFD process, and we just had a discussion a bit earlier on around the application of a TCFD process and a TNFD process, and that the TNFD process will potentially be a lot more onerous in implementation than what you've experienced through the TCFD. So if you have been battling with the TCFD process in terms of reporting, I've got news for you. I'm sorry. It is not a walk in the park. It's a lot of work, a lot of data analysis. And I think one of the recommendations, which I'll allude to now already, is that, there needs to, we need to consider, to what kind of level are we going to start applying these various frameworks, that it doesn't become too onerous. I do know that some of the international banks, and I will allude to people like Swiss Re, they have institutes, research institutes underneath their branding, which just do these type of calculations. So where they've got GIS specialists in there, environmental specialists, technical analysts, industrial engineers running processes and programs. So if you're a large South African bank with significant exposure, the report also has that in it. There's the top banks in the country and what your exposure and your market capitalization looks like. You can read that in the report. You've got to understand what is your risk appetite in terms of ensuring that your data is accurate, validated, and that it's comparable with your peers, and that it actually means management sense at the end of the day, because that's where the value lies. It's not in the disclosure itself. We don't want to see this kind of disclosure or the TNFD disclosure going towards a tick box exercise. And I think that's what's interesting, if I may just add a few little seconds onto this narrative, is that the TCFD as well as the TNFD process is by nature not a tick box exercise. You could construe that the GRI to a point, you look at the metrics, you report on the metrics, and you publish those metrics, and it can be seen as an ESG or tick box exercise. However, the pure nature of the TNFD and the TCFD, with the types of disclosures, and particularly the TNFD, where you start looking at scenarios, and it's those kind of scenarios which address your risk and your opportunities, which then feeds back into corporate and management decision making in terms of future-proofing that organization going forward. So just some of the reporting, once again, reporting frameworks applied by South African FIs, and this is out of 14 that comes out of the report. So the number of banks and the percentage adoption is just a little, is a bit more nuanced than the previous slide that I illustrated, but that just gives you a very interesting idea of the level of uptake of certain of these disclosure frameworks. As you can see, I think within the South African context, there's been a significant emphasis over the history with regards to corporate governance, and obviously having Mervyn King based locally and the work that's been done around the Value Reporting Foundation and how the King IV Code and the integrated reporting narrative has developed into that, we should have a significant uptake of that as a country. But I think, looking at the King IV Code and the capitals models, etc., it sort of supports and underpins where we're going with climate and nature-related disclosures also going forward. What's interesting, if you look at this, the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, quite a high uptake there, and the TCFD as well. So if you have a TCFD report, I think you're well positioned to tackle the TNFD when it comes along. I think particularly in those 4 thematic disclosure areas. However, I think there's a lot of complexity around the application of the LEAP process due to the fact that your credit exposure and your portfolios are multifaceted with many entities. If you were a single organization with a mining institution, a mining house, or a big agribusiness with relatively uncomplicated, and once again, supply chains, because you can go down the supply chain rabbit hole very quickly with the TNFD process as well. Setting your boundaries would be important. You can come up with quite authoritative and detailed and granular metrics to support your disclosure. However, it hasn't been a walk in the park, I think, with the FIs with regards to the detail around what those portfolios look like. And we'll be hearing from Madeleine after the tea break, if we do have one, with regards to their TNFD journey and what they've experienced with regards to that. So just other key thematic areas covered by the review, and I'm not going to go into detail around that. Please, the link will be provided for the report, and you can download it and go through it yourself. But just initiatives that are coming out of the SARB, Sustainable Finance Roadmap with regards to sustainability bonds, etc., green bonds, and how they're supporting that environment. And I think what's interesting, we're seeing a lot of that emerging in the South African corporate environment. So some banks issuing green bonds, and we've also seen some corporates such as Green Growth with their portfolio-linked green bonds with RMB and multilateral agencies supporting those developments as well. So risk evaluations process applied by FIs, and these are just some of the key thematic areas further in the report that I'm not going to go into in detail, and then looking at expenditure in the national budget with regards to budget tagging, etc., and the status of that budget tagging at the moment, and then looking at the role of science-based targets in that budget tagging, and then the use of fiscal instruments, penalties, levies, incentives, and taxes, etc., which are financial mechanisms that the regulatory institutions are applying in terms of environmental compliance. And I think once again, coming back to our statutory and our regulatory framework, unfortunately, we are regulated in boxes. There's very little intersectional and cross and multi-agent interaction between the different components, even as we speak about green finance. And as this report has illustrated and this narrative has illustrated, there is a definite overlap between institutional arrangements at a government level, cross-section. I mean, when we talk about nature, you cannot put nature in a box. And I think, and that's going to be, I think, those are some of the recommendations coming out is, how do we look at this cross-sectorally and cross-institutionally? So in saying that, I think I've alluded to many of the conclusions, But I think just to pick up on a couple of points, that nature-related disclosures is really a fast-paced emerging thematic area. You know, if we thought we made progress with climate change over the last 5 years, we're going to see that accelerated. If you see what's happening in this nature-related finance and this nature-related disclosure space, we've seen tremendous movement over the last 2 to 3 years. And it's been a post-COVID thing. I must be honest, you know, if I sit back and I look at it, I really see that interregnum as really highlighting the fact that nature is important. And we stood still for a couple of years, and now it is all guns blazing, in fact. And climate change has obviously dominated the disclosure environment to date, and I think we're seeing a systematic change of that, and we're seeing a convergence of that. I think 2 years ago, in any forum, I never heard anybody say that climate and nature were two sides of the same coin. And that is an emerging narrative which is probably a year old. We've done some work globally with regards to this kind of narrative, and we were toying with the idea. And it's interesting to see how that individually has been mainstreamed through multiple agencies in different jurisdictions, not even talking to each other. So there's definitely this awareness that the two are inseparable and that they're interrelated and interlinked and have impacts and dependencies on each other as it is. We've seen that the TCFD has been a voluntary process to date and widely adopted, I think, by global and domestic FIs as they have responded, I think, to this emerging climate-related shocks and surprise. But what we're also noticing that there are several jurisdictions emerging who are co-opting the TNFD framework into the national reporting frameworks. So we are starting to see that the TCFD process is starting to become mandatory in certain jurisdictions. And now with the emergence of nature-related risk impacts and dependencies over the past 3 to 5 years, we've seen that obviously the emphasis around the interacting relationship, and that climate change is both an impact and a driver of biodiversity loss. And we're seeing this increasing understanding, and I think this is what this narrative is all about, you know, that nature risks, related risks translate into financial risks. And I think what we're also experiencing is that currently and locally, there's poor guidance and clarity with regards to institutional support and guidance from a mandate as well as a capacity perspective. And I think that's a message I think that government is currently thinking about. Discussions that we've had with the regulator is that they are busy looking at this. Obviously, the private sector within this space, what we've experienced is that they're a couple of steps ahead in terms of the lag of policy, and that they have adopted TCFD frameworks, etc., on a voluntary basis and reporting that. And the question is, you know, is it from an internal perspective or is it external pressures that are being placed upon organizations to respond? And largely, it's been external pressure, but we've also noticed that there's currently internal pressures from organizations themselves internally in terms of looking at these aspects. And then the global disclosure and standards convergence, I've discussed that. What's interesting is that certain global north jurisdictions are also mandating sustainability disclosures. So what's coming out of the ISSB and work that's been done by IFRAG in Europe, there are decrees being mandated for sustainability reporting standards. And this is an interesting field for particularly, I think, South African corporates, is that it potentially has the impact of establishing barriers to trade and to entry. So it's going to become a lot more expensive for you to trade into the EU with products where you cannot verify its carbon footprint or your carbon disclosures. And we're seeing this with additional taxes, etc., being imposed on corporates that are trading into places like the EU, where these are becoming mandatory requirements. And we've seen, obviously, over the last 12 to 18 months, the development of the TNFD. We've been really close to that development. And that's all to support a shift, of capital towards more nature positive business initiatives. And we've also noticed, obviously, that there's currently a poor uptake by South African FIs with regards to that TNFD process, and for obvious reasons, as I've alluded to. And I think it's important to start engaging around that. I do know that the association is also looking at the TNFD process and nature-related disclosures, and they will come out with a statement in probably the next couple of weeks, etc., just to position that narrative within the association. So some recommendations that have come out of report, and there's a lot more than this, but I'm just going to allude to some of I think the key aspects, and that goes around the regulators. So the SARB and the PA, I believe, will be collaborating on developing guidance for the collation of nature-related financial disclosures. The position of the domestic finance institutions needs to be strengthened, I think, with respect to capacity, I think understanding of this field, and this is where it's important to understand their risks, the impacts, dependencies, and opportunities that are coming out of this disclosure environment. And then the industry body, representative associations, to provide technical and capacity support to their members. And I did allude to it earlier. I think the guidance needs to strike a balance between usefulness and necessary reporting requirements, and that it doesn't become too onerous. I don't know if there's going to be an opportunity to tailor, say, the TNFD process for an emerging economy application. I don't know what the kind of flexibility is, and I think it's important, as industry representatives here this morning, to influence that discussion, that global discussion. Because at the moment, unfortunately, I think our opportunity to comment on the TNFD process ended. So the piloting process was till June. So that opportunity has closed. But I do believe engaging with the TNFD going forward is still going to be important, as sector guidance still has to be developed at a large scale. And there's always opportunities with further iterations in terms of streamlining or adapting those systems. Just underneath the ISSB is considering its next phase of work plan, and the time is now actually to have input into that. And they have identified nature-related disclosures as one of the key work streams that they will be considering. However, looking at the content of what and the approach, I think there's room for improvement, and I think this is where the industry body needs to be heard in terms of how do we position South Africa, the global South, as an emerging economy into that narrative, that it doesn't become onerous, in terms of disclosure going forward. We've heard a couple of weeks ago with your association around specific disclosures, and I think everybody, corporate South Africa, has disclosure fatigue. And I think what's really promising is, going back to that earlier slide about the disclosure architecture, is that we're really seeing a global convergence of these, and we anticipate, so part of the recommendations is, adopt these global frameworks. Don't develop your own framework, don't develop a South African specific framework, but tailor the TCFD and the TNFD disclosure frameworks according to what would be applicable in our jurisdiction. And then lastly, and I would like Madeleine to take that discussion further when she presents on the TNFD process, is data and the focus on data integrity and accessibility. I think when we're talking about nature-related disclosures, this is one of the really, really, really hot topics, is the lack of data in terms of doing these leap assessments, and to ensure the metrics and the indicators that are relevant, they're accurate, and they're standardized across platforms. We've seen the release about 2 months ago of the nature component for the Science-Based Targets initiative, and it was around water metrics and land metrics. Water metrics, very similar in approach to what you have in the GRI. So once again, convergence between frameworks, But really we need to make sure that there's comparability between and across frameworks and entities. And I'd like to close with this quote by Piet Klop. He's a senior advisor for responsible investment at PGGM. And this, to me, sums up the complexity of trying to address biodiversity disclosure. Diversity is the opposite of investors' desire for standardization and comparability of things. Biodiversity is challenging because it really is the anti-commodity. Thank you very much. And if you would like to know more about TNFD and this specific work, please do reach out to Nokatule and Jane at the UNDP. They'll be more glad to assist. Thanks very much. Right. Nokatule, do you think we should have a tea break? Yep, let's have a tea break. We're a bit over time. There we go.
Okay, I don't know if there's any questions, but maybe after the tea break we can take 5 minutes to just interrogate a little bit if there's any interrogation needed. Thanks.
Thank you. And for our online audience, I think we're going to take a 15-minute tea break, and we'll see you back here at about 10 past 11, 10 past, quarter past 11. So that's fine with everybody. Thanks. Yes. Right, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed your tea, and for those of you online, I hope you got yourself something warm as well. We will take some questions if there are any. I see there's nothing online. So either you were baffled by complexity or it was too easy. Right, then I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Madeleine Ronquist. Madeleine is from the First Rand Group, and Madeleine has an illustrious history with the First Rand Group and in this nature-related space. Amongst others, the First Rand Group is one of two piloting South African banks of the TNFD process, and Madeleine is also representing First Rand on the TNFD task force. So she's got really first-hand internal perspectives in terms of the framework. And so Madeleine, if you would come up, please, and share your wisdom with us around your TNFD journey. Thanks very much.
Thomas. Hi, Thomas. Mandy has got her hand up. She's online. She's got a hand up.
Go ahead and unmute.
Sorry?
Mandy has got her hand up. Mandy, you can.
She's got a question. Mandy.
Mandy, you may go ahead and, yeah, there we go. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, I don't know. I didn't quite get my hand up in time. Hi, everyone. Very sorry not to be there in person. Mandy Driver. Until recently, I was at Sanby and now independent, and I've been very involved in the work that South Africa's done on natural capital accounting, working closely with Statistics South Africa. And I just wanted to so obviously, I'm thrilled that there's a focus on natural capital accounting and that's come into the study. I did want to clarify that it's not a reporting framework. So we wouldn't expect companies or financial institutions to adopt natural capital accounting as a reporting framework. What it can do is provide information, data and information, and potentially some metrics and indicators that can be drawn on as companies and financial institutions implement these other reporting frameworks. And there's a lot of work going on globally at the moment to look at what some of those consistent metrics might be that come out of ecosystem accounts and other types of natural capital accounts. And I think that would be a really useful discussion to take forward as we move forward with this in South Africa.
Thanks, Mandy. Thanks for that. We note. Right, Madeleine.
Thanks, Thomas, and thank you to the UNDP and BioFin for having us and hosting us here. A lot has been said, and Thomas has given me a very tall order to follow in his footsteps, and a lot of the things he has already said. But I would like to remind you of why it is that we are all doing the work that we are doing, and that is by a quote. It seems to me that the natural world is the greatest source of excitement, the greatest source of visual beauty, the greatest source of intellectual interest. It is the greatest source of so much in life that actually makes life worth living. And that comes from my idol, Sir David Attenborough. And I often read his books and his quotes just to remind myself of why I am doing this job. Because in my heart, I'm very close to nature, and I could have become an activist. I, in my career, have rather become a pragmatist, and that is taking the activism and putting it into business language, making it work, and specifically in the finance sector. The finance sector is a very, very interesting place and an exciting place to be. And I always say, yes, we don't have a huge impact by ourselves. but we finance the biggest impacts on nature, biodiversity, and climate. And therefore, we have a vested interest in all industries, which makes it very interesting, very compelling, but also very complex. Now, when we first started out with climate change, we kind of felt the same way that we are feeling now about the TNFD. It was slightly overwhelming. We didn't know where to start, and we were all kind of scratching our heads about what should we do first to have the biggest impact possible. With nature, this has always been underlying, and so much of the work that we did in climate risk reflected on nature, whether we were talking about species decline due to climate change, where natural evolution would have taken place over tens of thousands of years, now compressed into 150 years, simply not possible. Huge impact on species and on nature. Losing their ability to adapt so quickly. And then human intervention also leading to climate impacts, but leading to decline in species and huge impacts on nature. Because we've always considered this as a free-for-all. It's a community asset, and we all have access to it. But we never spent any thought on how finite nature really is. So I'm lucky enough to be a natural scientist by trade, and with some of my team members who are strong ecologists, this has been on our agenda for quite some time. We just had a conversation earlier about the timing not being right. I mean, I remember when I first started talking about nature and biodiversity, I think the reaction was one of pacifying. Yes, well, it's great. You know, you go hug a tree. Because the timing wasn't right. People didn't then, and I think they still don't maybe see the link to finance, to pricing of externalities, but it's beginning to happen. So I've been with the group for 22 years, and at the end of my career, almost the end of my career with First Rand, I am finally seeing the balls drop, and it is so satisfying because people are actually seeing this now. People are coming to me and saying, have you given this some thought? And I'm saying yeah, well, yes, but it's great that we're thinking about it now. And so we started our work quite a while ago, I think in 2009. Because the major impact for the bank is credit risk, we started a control mechanism where we screen transactions that we finance. And this is due to legal reasons, it's reputational reasons, ethically we wouldn't be associated with certain activities that pollute and destroy the environment. And we were led quite nicely by South African legislation. And we have a plethora of South African legislation that we could use as the baseline. So we were really financing around controlled risks or risk mitigation. Then in 2016, about when climate change and the TCFD hit our desks, we really started looking at nature and biodiversity at the same time again. And that is when we got involved with the development of the OnCall tool. And that was based on nature-related risk. And then later, we were also looking very closely at the biodiversity assessment tool that is in OnCall. And I think it was slightly disappointing for me at the time that we weren't using the tool enough or to its fullest potential because we weren't focused enough. There were not many users of the system, and yet the information was right there. And then as a scientist, if you got caught into a sector or an industry or subsector, then you could get quite lost with all the information about ecosystems, support systems, and so on. And it's really just so enticing to get lost in that world. And then you have to bring yourself a little bit back from the science and say, okay, let's turn this into business talk. And that's really what we've been trying to do. So I am very curious and by nature always scratch where there's no itch, and I really go into associating with partners who can teach me a lot. And that was what I really did when I first engaged with the Centre for Biological Diversity. We had come off the back of a previous framework that wasn't really successful. None of the targets had been reached, and it was really disappointing. But with renewed energy, I was part of a working group that was putting together the Global Biodiversity Framework and the principles, and got to know a few people who have been doing this for their whole lives. And I learned such a lot through that process. Got pulled into an association called Business for Nature, and they too had the opportunity to comment on draft parts of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and working up to COP15 in Montreal, where the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was signed off. And that was very satisfying. I think it's taken a lot more seriously. Sovereigns signed up to the Global Biodiversity Framework, and we now have to make it work. And further work that I'm supporting specifically is Target 15, and that is the authorities actually mandating reporting for multinational and for finance institutions. I feel very strongly and passionately about that, so I will support that as long as I have the energy to continue with doing that. With all the networking and getting to know people in this area, we were invited to be part of the informal working group of the TNFD. Now, this was a forerunner to the task force, and I think their work lasted about 6 months, and really a lot of thought and attention went into what it was we eventually wanted to put into the market. And you know, the normal things came out. It has to be understandable. This is a very, very complex issue. Very few people understand it. And even if you studied ecology, it's still quite complex. And what is it that we want to do? What is it that we want to put out there that could be understood quite easily by business, by financial institutions, that would make them want to, or understand why, at least, it is essential to report on nature and biodiversity. But also not just put the framework out there, and we had learned lessons from other frameworks, and we had the opportunity to also say, okay, well, let's write a lot of guidance, a lot of supporting documents, a lot of already kind of giving indications of what the core metrics would be for disclosure. But let's also focus on all of the work that has to happen before you get to the point of disclosure. As Thomas quite rightly said, this is not a tick box exercise. You cannot just tick off that I've done this, this, and this. There's a lot of work that has to go in before then. So then the next step was that they were putting together a task force. Initially there were 30 people in it. We ended up to be 40. And you had to be recommended by other institutions. I have a lifelong attachment to UNEP-FI, so they were one of the supporting organizations, and then to WWF as well. So I feel very honored that they invited us, but also I think there was a need at the task force to have an African continent representative, but also a finance sector representative. And that's how we made the cut. Not by any reason other than that, just because of that representation and because it's so important for the global north to also be thinking about the African continent. Over and above that, the African continent is the most diverse biodiversity continent in the world. We are very unique in terms of the biomes that we have, the specific topography and geography and locations that we have, and therefore critically important in the bigger scheme of things. And then the other thing is that obviously what is very important to South Africa is our tourism. So through our biodiversity, we lure people into coming to South Africa. I mean, anywhere in the world that you travel, everybody knows about the Kruger National Park. Further up in the continent, everybody knows about Botswana's nature reserves and so on, and that is why people make the trouble to come to Africa. And it's not just the parks. I mean, there are many other reasons to come to South Africa. There's biodiversity here that cannot be seen on any other continent. And that is why it was important to be part of this working group. So now we're at the point after 18 months of work, a lot of collaboration, working with many partnering organizations, I think almost 900 organizations. Having gone through 4 beta versions of the TNFD framework and getting comments, a lot of those comments, companies like ourselves working with third parties on case studies to test the TNFD and comment on it. And we have come to the point where I'm now at the moment, as we speak, when I go back to the office, working on the final recommendations to be signed off for publication, and the launch will be in New York City at the Stock Exchange on the 18th of September this year. So the end of the first work is coming to an end. The good news is that the task force will exist further, because what we realize is that as we all learn, as companies start implementing, there will be more questions, there will be more support needed, there will be more guidance needed from a task force and the supporting organizations to help organizations get through this process. Now, the other good news is also that there's a plethora of information on the TNFD Knowledge Hub. So if you want to go and read it, you can. But the only thing that is going to be published in September are the 14 disclosure recommendations. And there are slight deviations or nuances on those from the TCFD. They're very alike, so the 4 chapters are there. There's more focus on locations. As we know, in biodiversity, locations become critically important. Where the TCFD focused on risk and opportunities, there's now very specifically a reference to impacts and dependencies. And then I think there's a stronger recommendation in terms of stakeholder engagement. And those are Indigenous peoples, people who have an interest in a certain area, communities around protected areas, and so on. So I think what it's also going to require is that you have a policy or a strategy to engage with external stakeholders. So slight nuances, but not too much different to the TCFD. Now, so in the development, in the case studies, I've tried to stay agnostic, because I knew that the recommendations, as we knew them at the beginning of the 18-month journey, was going to change significantly. And so now I'm at the point where I say, okay, these are going to be the recommendations. Now we can start the fun. And so this is what we are doing. And so as I say, the 14 recommendations are the ones that you really need to focus on, whether you use the LEAP process, which is a good process, whether you use the guidance, whether you use the sector guidance, whether you look at what is recommended to be core metrics or additional metrics, and that too is a moving landscape. Remember, we got together with many organizations and everybody has their own opinion. So there may be some of the core metrics that you think could be additional, and there may be some additional metrics that you think could probably be core metrics for all companies to disclose. So there's core metrics to disclose, all companies, and then there are sector-specific guidance for core metrics that has to be disclosed by certain sectors. Then also we are writing at the moment a how to get started guide, which is something that, so I'm leading that working group because I was very passionate about it. I'm passionate about people in this industry, professionally coming out of university or coming from other organizations and having this huge landscape that they have to delve through. And where do they start? What are the first steps? Where do they have to apply their minds? Because nobody expects you to implement the TNFD completely overnight. This is a phased approach. And so some of the recommendations that we are making is get buy-in from senior management. I mean, that's where any sustainability expert will start. Otherwise, you'll do it in isolation, and people may be very condescending and saying, you're doing a great job, but nobody will ever take it seriously. It will never become part of the company strategy if you don't have that buy-in and leadership. The other thing is paint yourself a pathway or a roadmap of what you want to achieve by when, in small chunks. It's the old story about the elephant. Start somewhere. we're in no way saying that we think that you can only do some of the recommendations and then you can say that you are disclosing in terms of TNFD. There will be peer pressure, there will be pressure from society, there will be pressure for you to eventually be compliant with all of the recommendations of the framework of the TNFD. And then, despite the fact that the ISSB may probably not decide that nature and biodiversity is the most important topic to focus on next, because it is competing with human rights and with societal issues, which are equally as important, it doesn't really matter, because the sustainability disclosure standard talks about sustainability, and that's ESG, and the E is nature and biodiversity as well. And then please don't forget to add water into that mix somewhere. Nature, natural capital, water. Water is a big issue, not just for us, our country, but specifically for our continent, and there's such a close link between that and biodiversity that they're so integrated, there's no way that you can think about it separately. So tools that we have started using is IBAT, and that is specifically to look at protected areas. We refer very much to SANBI and to Stats SA to talk about the biomes of South Africa specifically, of which we have 9 different ones. We are doing the same thing as we did with climate accounting, because it's not a requirement for companies to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions. It's really difficult for a financier to measure our Scope 3 financed emissions if we don't know what the answer is. So a methodology was developed through the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials to try and use estimations and methodologies that are universally applicable, that can estimate or project data for you to work with, to know where your carbon intensive sectors are and where you need to focus. If you're in transition path like we are to net zero by 2050, then that information is critically important. We have done the same with PBAF, this stew, okay? PBAF is the Partnership for Biodiversity Accounting Financials. We are using that together with the WWF Biodiversity Assessment Tool to do a biodiversity footprint of one of our sectors. Now, that is interesting work. My team is busy working with that. So I will not say that I know anything about it at the moment. It's very technical, but it's going to be very interesting to see the results of that, because then you can literally see what the impact is in your portfolio. And I think what we've done as well is to move a lot away from just managing risk, but looking at opportunities. We have a whole team of specialists that sit in a biodiversity unit, so watch this space. And we are looking at dependencies, because that reflects a credit risk as well. And I've just, again, used the Encore tool to do an assessment of high risk or high intensity water users in different sectors, using the Encore tool to tell me this is the landscape and this is where you need to focus first. And maybe those companies, well, I think they will know that they're water intensive because it's a base product of whatever they finally manufacture. But the question is, if climate change is going to continue impacting our continent and having a severe impact on water availability and accessibility, what is it that those companies are going to do? Are they now going to change their method? Are they going to substitute? Are they going to use grey water and so on? And these are the conversations that we should be having at the moment with our clients. So I think I've said everything that I had to say, but I also wanted to say that whether you're a young professional coming into the market or whether you're old like me and about to end your professional life, I think any one of us comes to the point where you really want to make a difference. And this sounds very philosophical, but use whatever means you can to do that. An understanding of the natural world is a source of not only great curiosity, but of great fulfillment, I promise you. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Madeleine. Inspiring words, indeed. I think it's all about passion. I think that's why we're all here. So we're going to have a little panel discussion by some various institutional actors. So I would like to invite Madeleine back up onto the stage, please. Joan from the UNDP, and we've got Alex Marsh from SANBI online and Julie Clark from the DBSA. So if you could please get Alex and Julie online, please. Thank you.
Alex and Julie, if you could kindly just show your webcams for us.
Hi, I'm online. I can't show my webcam, sorry.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Alex. Thank you.
Hi, Alex. Welcome.
Hey, Thomas. Hi, everybody. Apologies for not being there in person today.
No problem. It looks like the weather is better where you are than where we are.
Yeah, we've got some sun, hey?
Fantastic. Is Julie online?
Yes, I'm here, Thomas. I'm
Okay.
online.
That's fine. That's good. We can hear you. Thanks very much. Right, so I'm going to jump right into it because we don't have too much time. I had a plethora of questions for each of the panelists because it's really an interesting topic and they're each going to bring a very different perspective to today's narrative, and that's why they've been chosen. But I've narrowed them down to 3 per person. So I'm going to ask for some the panelists, please, for really targeted responses, and I'd like to start with you, Alex. In that, so just a little bit of context. I think the report findings allude to the fact that national organs of state could ideally be responsible for collating nature-related financial disclosure data at 2 points of intervention. I think the DFFE SANBI connection, collating nature aspects of financial data, then the regulator looking at the more financial data linked to nature-related risk disclosure. So I'm going to give you three items, and I think we're going to get through them in that order instead of me coming back to you because we might just not have that opportunity due to time. But I think firstly, could you tell us what SANBI and DFFE is doing in regards to nature, the finance nexus, and especially around your work with the NCA and Stats SA and the current DFFE commitments around the GBF, around target 14, and if you could touch maybe on target 15. I think that was really interesting that Madeleine brought up 15 in terms of the regulatory response to the targets, and then maybe just allude to some of the work that we've been party to this last couple of months around the AFD study, around the Silent Spring. You don't have to elaborate around detail of the report, but just touch on key takes out. And then I'd like to ask you, following that, where do you and how do you anticipate this nature-related finance mechanism or narrative, developing into the future from a national institutional perspective?
That's a mouthful. Thank you, Thomas, for all of those questions. Maybe to start with speaking to the GBF. So working with the department, I've also been involved in negotiations kind of for the past 4 years in the lead up to the new GBF, and it's been really fascinating to see how central the conversation around business and biodiversity has become. As we've seen increased focus on mainstreaming and resource mobilization, I think that specifically in South Africa, there is more focus on the way that we create a whole of society approach and work more intentionally in more varied ways with civil society and business on these issues. And I think it was really heartening to see the the amount of lobbying happening from business in terms of their welcoming of Target 15. And I think that the government has definitely paid attention to that. There is, out of the kind of 4 focal areas that we're looking at in terms of the targets in the GBF, along with 30 by 30 and restoration, areas around mainstreaming business and biodiversity and resource mobilization are absolutely central. So I think it's a time of creating new partnerships towards implementing Target 15, which is starting already a bunch of new conversations. I think that there's a Jeff 7 project starting now that's around business and biodiversity. The department and UNDP and SANBI have been working together on creating some kind of project for the Jeff 8 implementation period, also around business and biodiversity. So there is an absolute recognition that it's time to focus on the policy enablers, the flow of information, and the kind of working relationships necessary to draw on the momentum that's been created. So the department's currently in a process of creating an implementation plan for the GBF, and there'll be a range of consultations over the next 6 months in support of that. And then in terms of what SANBI and the department are doing within the kind of biodiversity finance nexus, I think that the report speaks very well to the work that's happening in the NCA space, where StatSA is leading in putting together accounts for air emissions, energy, strategic water source areas, terrestrial ecosystems. There's a biodiversity economy satellite account being created. So like these pieces of information and the way that they're collating them is really going to support nature-related financial disclosures. So that is an area of work that is going to be expanding into the future. More related to the work that I've been doing is working over the past year with the French Development Agency on a nature-related risks and opportunities technical working paper. So over the past year, we've been working with macroeconomists, with the head of our national biodiversity assessment, with various other specialists, to create a paper that kind of draws on the Silent Spring report that the AFD did in 2021, that's very domesticated for South Africa. So we have a focus on water security, we have a focus on ecosystems, and we also have a focus on opportunities, because we're wanting the report to be very grounded in the developmental context of South Africa. So not to get too much into the detail, but there's quite a lot coming out around where certain municipalities are exposed to risks and dependencies. We've also used the study to apply it to the South African Reserve Bank loan book. They've been a core partner with us, and that's starting to give us really interesting data about the financial implications and exposures and what pathways for mitigation could mean. So the paper will be published later this year, and we're engaged currently in a series of policy dialogues, so involving National Treasury, the Reserve Bank, Department of Water and Sanitation, Department of Science and Innovation. You've been in some of those yourself, Thomas. So really starting to reach out to the stakeholders, the people who we'd want to partner with in order to expand on the nature-related financial risk work in South Africa. And it's a fast-moving train. So in terms of the way that we're looking at supporting TNFD compliance, this working paper does follow the LEAP approach explicitly. So it really does help and lean into TNFD disclosures. And something that we're thinking about as we work further and figure out phase 2 of the work is, what does it mean for data, for our spatial information, for the flow of information, the way that business is able to access the really sophisticated wealth of spatial information that we do have in South Africa. We're quite unique in that way, but also how do we start having a two-way flow of information so that we're building a knowledge base together, and also very importantly, interpreting the data together. Should I stop there, Thomas? I don't know how much.
Yes, that's great. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Alex, for that context. And I think leading on from that level, I'd like Joan to come in over here. And I think, UNDP as one of the more prominent multilateral agencies have been providing this kind of technical and capacity support to governments, over globally. So through the BioFin program and UNDP Africa Sustainable Finance Hub, can you provide some context as to what the UNDP is doing globally? I think number one, with regards to nature-related finance disclosures, and how do you see your involvement in positioning in assisting the regulator and those institutions in building the necessary capacity? And maybe what you can do is also how you're leading the global conversation around this as well.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I don't know if people online can hear me. Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. And it's, as I said earlier, I'm delighted to be here. This conversation for us as UNDP is very central to achieving the SDGs in a sustainable long-term, so with a long-term vision on how we can achieve the SDGs. UNDP has been engaged in this space for many years, and with a plethora of projects and programs that we've been doing with governments, with private sector, with various stakeholders around nature, biodiversity, climate. The Biodiversity Finance Program itself, BioFin, sort of began in 2012, very much as an innovative program that was really looking at supporting governments to finance their biodiversity needs, looking at the financing gaps, looking at how budgets, national budgets are being allocated towards nature-related investments, and utilizing a range of tools from policy, institutional reviews, expenditure reviews. I remember being very involved with biodiversity and climate change expenditure reviews that were geared towards informing governments about where they should be prioritizing their budgets and their money in order to ensure that they were developing in a way that was sustainable. And once you do those sorts of assessments, really trying to move forward now as we're moving into sort of the phase 3 of BioFin program, to looking at financial strategies, finance plans, and then implementing them through a range of different financing instruments. So our role is really often within the policy space, as has been mentioned. And I think it's critical because there's a lot that can be done in signposting sort of the roadmap towards sustainable finance. And then also our sort of complementary role is around capacity building, especially around the institutions that are responsible for not just issuing policy and regulation, but also implementing it. So we've got a bit of a broad approach, but I think it's critical. And in terms of the Africa Sustainable Finance Hub, I think the narrative sort of was beginning to shift to look at how the financial sector actually could start to be a major player in leveraging private capital, aligning it towards SDG-related outcomes and impacts. And that required a slightly different lens in terms of, understanding how the financial sector functions, and coming from a development and climate change perspective, really changing our mindset and understanding what is material when it comes to financial considerations. So we've developed a number of programs, again, around that kind of work, looking at impact standards, looking at, a lot of the work that was already being done under the sort of Network for Greening of the Financial System, and of course the TNFD, TCFD, sorry, which was an initiative that we've been engaged on from the beginning. So the sort of coming to maturity of the TNFD, and we've heard also the point about, there's going to be even more disclosures around inequality and so on, and social aspects. We're very engaged at that level. Critically, in the last 3 years, we've become quite engaged at the G20 as part of the Secretariat for the Sustainable Finance Working Group. And that has allowed us to kind of come into the conversation with a strong sort of focus on impact, strong focus on sustainability, medium and long term, but also understanding how to then unpack that into bite-sized pieces for the institutions that really need to do the work on the ground. And I think that's what we're seeing now, is really how do we start to integrate this into businesses at large, into financial systems, and into the regulatory systems that influence how capital is deployed. And we have a number of programs around that globally, and BioFin, of course, is one of the big ones. But we have a number of programs around that in terms of insurance and risk financing, in terms of the integrated national financing frameworks that we're talking to governments about as well. So really trying to come at the financing issues from a holistic, sort of integrated perspective. And I think the report also sort of points out that there's a comprehensive and wide-ranging institutional framework into which this conversation really needs to take root and move forward. So that's been the sort of role of UNDP, and I think we're moving a lot more into trying to understand how we can unlock private capital using these sort of tools and levers, right, in terms of making sure that we sort of enhance and refine sort of the reporting, sustainability reporting when it comes to the private sector as well. So looking at it from a financial system as a whole, I think that's kind of been our role right from the beginning, and that's what we continue to move forward with.
Thanks, Jane. I think there's a lot of touch points, I think, and I think one of the key messages that's starting to emerge is this, institutional alignment, between, government institutions and the private sector. I know that Alex and myself and a number of our colleagues have had quite a round robin around, a finance mechanism advisory group in terms of collating and integrating these kind of initiatives, that there's actually, that we sort of ensure that there's no duplication of effort and work that takes place, because a lot, like we said, it is a fast-moving space. I'd like to go to you, Madeleine, and I think you were quite comprehensive in terms of your presentation. So I'm trying to find these levers and these jewels of knowledge which you haven't shared with us before. So I'm going to take a stab on that. But I think the first one is, how aligned to the GBF is your nature-related journey and aspiration as a first-rank group? And really specifically, where do you see, because of your experience in piloting the TNFD and a nature-related finance disclosure framework, where do you see nature-related disclosures going into the future, in terms of uptake specifically, and what should be done to ease and assist this transition and adoption?
I deliberately said a lot so that you didn't have any questions left. In terms of our work being aligned with the GBF, I think more so than one would think. I mean, the Global Biodiversity Framework is aimed at sovereigns, and yet, because we were so involved in actually writing the targets and talking about harmful subsidies and Target 15 and resource mobilization and so on, I think these are all things where we feel that we can play a large role. And so it's definitely the baseline, I would say, for the TNFD work. So we're doing a lot of it off the back of the principles and the targets. So we haven't set our short or medium targets as yet, but I can foresee that it will be fully aligned with the GBF. In implementation of the TNFD, we've tried to ask that question as well. So we've done a little bit of research to see what companies are currently disclosing. And we're still doing some of the research, but I was really surprised by some companies who, they're obviously multinationals and they already trade internationally. They have pressures from the Northern Hemisphere, who go into a lot of detail in terms of biodiversity assessment. And they also come out at the top of local studies that are done on their disclosures. And these are the usual, don't let me say suspects, these are the usual stars. They are the ones who are in exploration, they are the ones who are in agric, they are the ones who understand their deep dependence on nature. So the paper manufacturers, so just a few of them. And when we first engaged with DFFE, we had a private meeting beforehand with these large companies, many of them clients of ours and of the other banks as well. They're very large companies, so we all have a stake in them, and how they see biodiversity and what they disclose. And my message to them was, so we've spoken about overworking and over disclosure and disclosure fatigue, and many of them saw the TNFD as yet another framework that they now have to comply with, and that is not the message. The TNFD recommendations are fully aligned with what was already in the market. You've mentioned a lot of the alphabet stew, the CDP. I mean, the forerunners of the TNFD was taken into account when the system or the disclosures were developed. And we wouldn't have had large players like the WWF and the WBCSD and all the other alphabet soup as collaborating partners if they didn't believe in the fact that this was a getting together of one universal standard that we can all apply. Doesn't matter which angle you come into it from. What I was also interested to see is that these industries, these companies have done a lot of work, and they started a long time ago doing the work. And so they already have a lot to report. And that was really refreshing, because usually the finance sector leads the pack and then battle to get everybody on board. I think the finance sector may be slightly behind the curve for the large companies and following quickly in their footsteps, but learning a lot in the process, because who better understands their processes and their dependencies than the companies themselves? So I think this will be a natural evolution, let's call it that, of the disclosure recommendations in that format. And the simple reason for that is comparability. It's information to investors who want to compare like with like. It's not, and it's all in one place. Now if you go and do research on biodiversity disclosure, it's all over the place. Sometimes it's in the ESG report, the report to society, the integrated report, the TCFD report, and many companies wonder, is this yet another report? And I mean, we're thinking along the same lines. Can we not integrate this report into some of our other reports where it makes the most sense? And that is probably what will happen, because if you see it in a silo approach, you'll probably be totally overwhelmed by the number of reports that you have to put out there. But for an example, you see it as an integrated process with climate risk, and you combine the two in an integrated way and you get it right, then that is already half the battle won. I mean, then you can report in one report. I think the importance is just to make sure that whoever is going to read the report knows where to find the information, that it's easily accessible. Sometimes when you do research on sustainability reporting, it's quite difficult to find the information. Some of the websites are not very friendly. But, the message is continue what it is that you were doing before, align it as much as possible with the recommendations. You will recognize it straight away. And what makes it easier is that it is already written in the style of the TCFD, so we're all quite used to it by now. Because that's the other thing that we've also learned, that if a company or an independent third party wants to do an assessment of what is being disclosed or what is happening in organizations, they get a very skewed view of what is going on if they only look at what is disclosed publicly. Because all of us have been doing this work kind of below the sea level, and we're now ready to start disclosing on what it is that we're doing. And I think we're in for a very pleasant surprise to see what companies have been doing. Always positive.
Thanks, Madeleine. I'm tough to see that. I at least did find a crack in your armor for some questions. Julie, are you there?
I'm here.
All
I'm
right,
right
Julie.
here.
Okay, so questions I have for you is, as South Africa's most prominent DFI, you are in a relatively unique position in providing financial capacity to further the developmental agenda in South Africa and further abroad. So I think what we'd like to hear from you is, what has been your institutional uptake, I think, of nature-related risk disclosures been like, and what kind of institutional support has there been with regards to structural finance reform or a more green approach to financing infrastructure in the DBSA? And what part do you see the TNFD playing in the DBSA's disclosure architecture going forward? And I think, Julie, for our previous engagements, you've done some interesting work with integration of different platforms and different frameworks such as IBAT, Encore, and the likes. And maybe if you can take us through a bit of your DFI journey in this regard. Thanks.
Thanks, Thomas. Are my slides showing at all?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So I just wanted to quickly just say from a background point of view that it's fundamental. This journey is driven by an inner wisdom. It is not driven by facts or metrics or any other or tools. It is driven by people who want to do the right thing, who are concerned with human rights because they are very closely linked to nature, and who are concerned with being responsible investors in every part of the way. And there will always be two tides going in any organization, depending on the push and the pulls, and they have to be managed. So the legal thing is the easier thing to do, and the moral thing is the harder thing. And we've just been fortunate in DBSA to have CEOs that have really tried to do the moral thing. They've been strong on morality, and that's helped us enormously in our journey, because from the top down we've had that ethic. And a lot of the journey is transferring financial talk, which is a lot in spreadsheets, but not really. There's also a lot of systems thinking in financial institutions. And then eco talk. And eco talk is also a lot of mathematics. A lot of our DNA is mathematically coded. So both of these come together beautifully when we do the nature journey. And there's this terrible thing that we have learned in our organization that other banks will often go through, is that you will build a beautiful forest and create it and shape it, and then in one moment ashes can be made by a single match or a single incident. It can be a restructuring, it can be a changing of a position, it can be anything, and you have to learn to rebuild it again. And the more you get nature into the DNA of your organization, the more it can withstand these organizational changes or fallouts of individuals who are champions, or financial difficulties, or whatever it is, changes in the country or the continent you work in, and so on. So it's getting nature, a culture of nature, into the actual DNA of the organization that will help the organization drive through these rough periods. And of course, focusing on three points always: greening finance, which means you're taking hardcore finance decisions and making them much greener, mainstreaming them to become a green finance bank, in other words. And then financing green initiatives and building partnerships. Yes, Thomas?
Thanks. Sorry, could you just put your slides into presentation mode, please?
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Sorry. Slideshow. from this very beginning. Okay, so that's really the story of the bank. And so when you do these last three, greening finance, financing green, and building partnerships, that's when you're getting it rooted. And we as DBSA, we've always been aware of the risks. They're macro risks, they're micro risks specific to projects, macro risks beyond projects, and they all translate into our organizational risk as a finance institution. So we've been aware of those for a long time. It's how to translate those. Knowing nature's material to DBSA has been very specific. This is just a beautiful picture because Madeleine was saying, beware of water. If we've analyzed our loan book thanks to the water risk filter and thanks to Encore, and whatever we do, whether we're doing IBAT or whatever tool is out there, it boils down to water, water, water. And it's our biggest risk that we are facing. And this just shows turn of the century, 1.5 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa are living with unsafe water, and it's a devastating story that we have to turn around, and it is within our means to turn it around, and that's a good thing. The Green Climate Fund as a partner has helped us look at, what ways to translate this for DFIs. Where should they be putting their thinking capacity and their creativity and how they can use their own strengths to try and think not just in terms of project investments, but in terms of enabling environments and in terms of sustainable investments, in terms of scaling up, in terms of synergies with adaptation and mitigation and so on. So this is where DFI's thinking is going now. And then how can we pull in, don't do what private sector can do, because that's just a duplication. We can't afford duplications. Don't do what government is doing, because government must do what they must do, and they mustn't overlap what a DFI or a private institution can do. If we all play our roles very specifically, we will make it through the cracks that are left to hope. And we've taken that beautiful thing that you gave us, Thomas, that picture of multidimensional thinking in terms of all of these risks. That is so cool, because in DBSA, we've looked at any project, you can name anyone. And if one of these is knocked, if it becomes a liquidity risk or an operational risk, they all get a knock. It is a systems thing. Risk is a systems-based approach, and you can't do it in boxes. And I love that slide of yours. I'm going to borrow it for my future presentations. And we looked a lot at the global biodiversity framework and looking at opportunities and transition risks and reporting and disclosures and so on. And each of these have targets. And when you say, well, how are these going to relate to what is DBSA's specific target for each of these core things? Nice slide from the AFD that we also borrowed from them. So our journey has been made up by our partners. We've helped them and they've helped us. And the IDFC was the very first thing we did. They gave us a policy position that we helped craft as one of 40 banks or so. And that policy position was very much aligned with the global biodiversity framework. And our CEOs all adopted that, and that saved all the problems in the institution of debating and deliberating over words. That was adopted. Now work with it and live with it and make it happen. It was a great start. 40 banks immediately on the same journey. And that included a lot of commitments already. And that is public. So all of that is disclosed. And then DBSA framework, we based it on TNFD. Thank you, Madeleine, because it couldn't have been a more beautiful framework. And everybody thinks it's difficult, but when you get into it, it is so beautifully done. The guidelines are so helpful. It just is an enabling framework that puts you on the road and you don't get sidetracked and you see the wood for the trees right from the beginning. So I can't recommend it enough to anyone on this journey, wherever you're at in the journey, to dip into that and to use that as an aspiring framework. Support the network growing. I mean, here are two examples here where we're getting a lot of support, people asking us for our metrics, what are we willing to disclose as a group, or what are we willing to disclose as a bank itself. And then we've got other private sector coming in and helping us too. So it's all just been a two-way help. WWF have been incredible with their water risk filter. When we first embarked on this journey, it was also through the DBSA Jeff Sanby project, which was EI, or Ecological Infrastructure for Water Security. And we helped and put in a lot of work into funding into this WWF water risk filter to detail it for South Africa, it has made the difference. It has saved us months of analysis. So it's such a quick way to analyze your loan book, and highly, highly, highly recommended that people do that, because as a quick first step, it really, really helps us. Encore really helps us to understand dependencies and to articulate it and to send it straight up to management and to say this is where DBSA is highly dependent. And I've got some slides on that, but I thought I'd show them later if there's time. And then that AFD partnership that Sanby and Jeff and DBSA had with regard to looking at a macroeconomic study in South Africa. They did the study for all of us. We don't have to repeat the painful process again. It's there for all of us, and we picked and chose from it what we needed to present to our management. And then the TNFD I've spoken to, and the challenges and lessons learned and sharing has been giving us leaps and bounds of growth and forced us to grow. So from early stages to being more developing in practice to advance. So that's really been our journey, and just examples of how the TNFD, what they did for us was they hired a consultancy that meets us every 2 weeks and says, now where are you at? And it forces us also, and they help us too with whatever we need help with. So it's just been a nice two-way process, and these are other banks involved in that pilot study. So it's thanks to partnerships, and then they appoint consultants that help the collective, which works very, very well, because we can't all afford to go and hire all of those consultants and repeat it for each bank. So thank you for that too. And that leads us to our own creative journey, because it's like a marriage. Every bank just has its own personal journey, and we've had ours, and we've won and we lost, and then we've regained, and then we've won again, and we've had key milestones that everybody in the bank bought into at certain points in time, and that creates your own personal bank picture. And it's just nice to sometimes just map it and show people what you've achieved, because you're so aware of this side, what you haven't done and haven't achieved, and everybody's asking you for that. Meanwhile, you've done so much, and it's just nice to map your journey to show how everybody fitted in and what everybody did, and how you couldn't have got to where you are at the moment, which is on the brink of good disclosures, without all of this happening first. And it's just a nice way to show it. I wanted to just throw in a slide here, just saying, how we can get that money for nature and fight for that money for nature. But if you're not mainstreaming into these investment decisions, nature's finished. So this is just examples of a road projects that have damaged nature. It will cost hundreds of millions to ever repair. These are not DBSA projects. Hundreds of millions to ever repair that harm. But you've got to fight it where the harm is happening, as well as just go for green projects. So if these are happening through National Treasury or through roads departments or through municipal projects or wherever they're happening, that's where we have to go and target, because it doesn't have to happen. Every road should leave a nature positive footprint and not a destructive wake. And the same, we've also learned a lesson with, things like investing in hydropower dams. If they're high risk to nature, don't engage them, because once you've engaged them, it becomes very political to pull out. So rather refrain from ever engaging if you suspect high nature risk, high livelihood risk, high human rights risk. Just stay away right from the start. And then there's the issue of all of these utility companies coming up in the energy sector, and it's time to really link them with nature positive impacts. And we haven't done it enough. The cumulative impacts of these are high. Doing these little Mickey Mouse EIAs doesn't work. Getting onto funders and funders financing them under sort of reprograms and all the rest. We need a much more rethink on how our energy sector translates into a biodiversity benefit for all. And I know the sector is so burdened right now with so much and so many issues that it's hard to push in another dimension. But the just transition is exactly that. The just transition is ensuring you leave no one behind. And if we are going to leave nobody behind in our energy sector, then the link with biodiversity and human rights is absolutely critical, and we can't miss that opportunity. So that was just a quick introduction, but I wanted to, if there's time, I just wanted to say where we come short is compensation and enhancements. You know, that is where we're really weak in South Africa on EIAs, and the rest of Africa doesn't even see that. And then banks have safeguards that try and do that, and they try and get the offsets going where, you know, maybe the law is weak at. And our EI for Water Security project tried to also look at offsets, but over and above offsets is this transformative change that we're looking at. And it's now, how do you measure that? How do you measure how this is a beautiful 4-step approach for transformative change if you haven't seen it? But how do you actually take, it's easy to measure the mitigation factors and the, you know, the offsets that are legally required and blah, blah, blah. That's all standard, although very weakly done. What we need to do now is get into this transformative approach where you're not just addressing the project mitigation hierarchy, you're actually addressing this negative trend in biodiversity, and you're using any project or any investment you can to try and address this at a higher level. So you might, if you're doing a lot of energy projects or a lot of road projects, you might just go one level up and do a sector assessment of how you can engage the sector as a whole. And that's where real change happens. So that's just what I wanted to point out. Sorry if I spoke too long, but thank you.
Thanks, Julie. We really appreciate your insights. And it's always a breath of fresh air to have you in a panel or on a discussion, because I really believe the work that the DBSA is doing is pioneering in certain instances. Thanks very much. Look, we don't have much time. I think we run over time, so I'm going to ask each one of the panelists, and I'm not going to take questions and answers, just to give me 30 seconds. Last opinions. Madeleine.
I'm excited. I think there's a lot to look forward to. What use is a boring job? This is a big challenge. It gives us something to apply our minds. And as I said before, it's an intellectual challenge which keeps us all alive.
Thanks. Alex?
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly exciting time to be working in this space. And what I'm really looking forward to over the next year is the new kinds of partnerships, building understanding across different sectors, and really working together in a different way than we have before, like breaking down the silos that we've been stuck in for so long, and finding out what the working relationships can be, because I think we're all pulling in the same direction and feel that very clearly right now. So I'm really looking forward to the conversations that are going to come next.
Thanks, Julie.
So for me, it's there's many points of intervention in this, and it's never ending. And don't try and do everything all at once, because you can't. So just start with your roadmap, and then your points of intervention, like financial models or investment opportunities, or quantify and disclose. You know, those are your critical intervention points. And even if you do one little thing at a time, they will build up into where you want to go, but you can't get there in one leap. You've got to take everybody with you, and that takes time.
Thanks, Julie. And then Joanne, as the host of today's event, and Nokatula.
Just quickly, I think from my side, a couple of final reflections. I think I echo everyone else's enthusiasm and excitement about doing this work now, and in this space. But I think the time for trying to sweep things under the carpet and maybe hope it won't come back and bite us, I think that's well over. And I think it's important to now start really thinking about how we can do business today with the future in mind. Because I think we've tended to do business with the past going, well, we'll do an incremental 10% on top, and looking backwards that way. Whereas we really should change and go, what is the future we want to see? What is the future we want to leave for our next generations, and really think about what that means for business today. So that's kind of what I would say is quite important for us to think about.
Thanks very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, on that note, I would like to thank the UNDP for for hosting this event this morning. I think it has been interesting. You know, I think we've touched on an emerging thematic area which is critical for us to address today, as we've heard from each of the panelists. I'd like to thank everybody who made a presentation, and thank you to the panelists. I really appreciate your participation. It's always interesting to be in a forum where there's some new ideas and fresh ideas that come out. You know, in preparation for today, I alluded to the fact that, you know, generally in the broader ESG space, you know, if you've heard the narrative 2 weeks ago, you heard the same one a year ago, you've heard it 5 years ago. But I think we can, each one of us will be leaving the session with some really key take-home points, you know, in terms of positioning our institutions and, you know, ultimately personally ourselves. So I'd like to say thank you for that. Thank you to Mark Avera from Prime Africa for their research and the report that they developed. Thank you for the JSE for the venue and the catering. And on that, I would like to close, and thank you to everybody for participating and joining the event. Thanks very much.
Thank you.